Great question. And really, it can be a very variant answer depending on, country to country. So, for example, in the UK, putting money into these buildings, particularly if they are iconic and important from the point of view of the royal family, it's almost mandatory. I'm sure they will take away your
Okay.
British passport if you don't say that. Of course, the Tower of London and Westminster Abbey and York Minster and however many more need to be preserved, right? Um, Ironically, from the point of view of local history, we are not really doing that, which is a shame. And that is where the British public are actually very divided on what needs to be preserved, what doesn't have to be preserved, what we've made quiche and cliche, things that maybe had value, things that maybe we've given value, but they were not that special when they were made. And that, in the UK is definitely a polarizing situation from normally, from where the focus goes to, because the focus normally goes to the same places. And that is problematic. We see it now, particularly in the post-Brexit world, and without necessarily wanting to get political, this is, a very serious problem. Many, many, many places in the EU, particularly places in rural communities, places where, their church is still the medieval church that their ancestors were using and that hasn't really been changed because there was no money for it, thrive and survive on those funds from the European Union to preserve local heritage.
Oh,
The pre-Romanesque of Spain would have been very lost if it wasn't thanks to those European funds, thanks to the help of UNESCO. In torn-worn countries like it was old Yugoslavia, it would have been similar the case. I promise you that the vast majority of, particularly, places that don't have necessarily that wealth of money to preserve their buildings are very keen to keep them alive. Now, when we look at individual countries and specifically their medieval past, besides the UK, in France is a problematic issue and was already a problematic issue when the conservation work began because of precisely, who was funding it? Where was the money coming from? In fact, fun story that maybe some of you would not know. I am sure that all of you would be familiar with the incredible fortress that is Carcassonne. UNESCO heritage site, one of the best preserved fortresses, both from the Middle Ages and with Roman elements in the whole world. Well, Carcassonne was this close, and I'm literally talking demolition machines were already outside waiting to happen because it had just fallen in disuse. It was not necessary for the overall development of France at that moment on, particularly since the time of Napoleon. The southern border between France and Spain had changed. Carcassonne was no longer exactly in the frontier, and overall, the military was located somewhere else. But it is only because the very controversial restoration of Notre Dame happens with the very famous restorer, Eugene Viollet-le-Duc, only because he starts doing that, that they manage by local subscription to convince the government to keep Carcassonne because it matters to the locals. And that is why Viollet-le-Duc ends up going to Carcassonne and yet making a renovation or a conservation of what is the wall, which many of the locals don't approve of. Because this is in the south of France. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to Carcassonne, by the way, but if you have, there is at least the best place of noticing this is in the rooftops. So in Carcassonne, there is three different types of roof tiles. You have the Roman tiles, which are, your typical red tile. Then you have the sort of chalky fishtail or fish scale type of black roof chalk that is very typical of the north of France and specifically the Loire Valley, but not of Occitane. And then you have the traditional shingles of Occitane. Violette Leduc was from the north of France and had done a lot of restorations in Paris and in the Loire Valley, and therefore the roof tiles that he puts, although beautiful and medieval-like, are not are not typical of what the architecture of the area would be. So, in recent renovations with UNESCO heritage money, the locals have decided that while keeping the majority of the fortress as it is, and without wanting to diss the work that Violette Leduc did to keep this proper, that they want to go back to what they believe the castle would have looked like, truly, in medieval times, in the south of France, in Occitan. So the controversy goes, to many levels. The restorations are, you know, tricky. There is a very, 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 very famous controversial issue in Spain that literally happened a couple of years before the COVID pandemic of the restoration of the Ecce Homo. This is a typical Christ crucified from the Middle Ages in a small rural church that was falling to pieces. And the restoration, because nobody seemed to care and the church didn't have money for it, because in Spain, churches receive some money from the government, but there is a separation now between state and church, so it's not the same. And not every single country has, let's say, a tax for the church. A woman from the village grabbed the Ecce Homo from the Middle Ages, took it to her house, and with acrylic paints from the shop, restored it. And And then there was a world of outrage between you've just ruined a medieval, you know, piece of sculpture, between the world, but if this woman wouldn't have intervened, would we still have that medieval piece of sculpture, horrible and potentially ugly as the restoration may be? So it is actually a very, very, very tricky situation, and it normally comes down to three main factors: whether there is or not a specific tax or levy or organization that takes care of religious buildings for the purpose of keeping them not as religious buildings, but as heritage monuments, right? Because to some extent in Europe, we cannot entirely detach our religious background from heritage and culture. The very funds that the government has from a cultural, perspective allocated, and to some extent, whether the government is promoting national buildings, it's promoting tourism, or it's promoting what the community requires, which of course can be very different. And then, of course, is the public. And the public normally is divided between two sections. The public as ordinary members of the public, members of their community doing what they can for the things that matter to them, and the public through private organizations or through charities. Many of the brilliant monuments, churches, castles, etc., that we have all across Europe are actually now protected by charities or by academic institutions that barely have any money, but because members of the public don't want to lose that, make donations, and they make them survive, or the work of museums. Many European countries protect buildings that are otherwise falling apart by creating a museum or a cultural institution in that place, whether it's related to that or not. But it's a very, very complex situation, and it very much comes down to the very essence of the question of, how do we make this decision? Well, the problem is that this decision changes pretty much generation by generation, decade by decade. Um, and it is, to some extent, something where there has to be a balance, right? Just because something was very important, very unique, and very remarkable in the Middle Ages, and served a purpose, because in the Middle Ages it served a purpose, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to do the same for us now. And drawing those lines can be extremely hard. The world of the digital humanities, I don't know if any of you are familiar, but the movements of the digital humanities, which is an overall movement that has come part from archaeology, antiquarianism, and medievalism, are often very much involved in this idea of how much of this is nostalgia, how much of this is stuff we need to actually preserve, how much of this is of genuine value, and why do we ascribe this value? Are we ascribing value from the past? Are we ascribing value from the present? And what are we trying to achieve with that process? Because, of course, one of the other biggest reasons why in many European countries many of these monuments have been preserved haven't been for cultural values, but it has been for tourism. Now,
Tourism, yeah.
now many of those same places are complaining that they have too much tourism. Now, I don't know what you want me to tell you. There has to be a point of discussion where the purpose once again has to be reevaluated. And the problem is that the purpose of a lot of these buildings, pieces of art, etc., and the places where they are was ascribed to them in times that are no longer relevant or the same. And it is a very, very, very serious um, problem in terms of policy and policy making. And there are now, believe it or not, degrees, not many, but degrees in the world of history that actually discuss exactly this topic: medieval policy, antiquity policy, historical policy in terms of infrastructure, value, community preservation, which is complicated. And again, I really must emphasize it's so different from country to country. In the EU, I feel we are a bit privileged because, of course, it is an international forum where everybody, at least to some extent, can chip in and at least, you know, get this idea. But if we push this farther from, let's say, Europe, if we push it to the confines of the European world or the European adjacent world, and specifically the Mediterranean world, think about countries like Turkey or Egypt, which have had half of their heritage taken away from their homelands, allegedly under the idea of being protected. And now
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
in a
yeah.
completely different situation. Well, I'm sure you'll have seen in the news that Egypt is saying, hello, UK, start sending us half of your collection in the British Museum. Because now they have this incredible facility, and I actually know some of the people that work in making the museum. Is I am sure it is safer than some prisons in this country. The
Uh-huh.
standard of security that has gone into making this for the sake of protecting Egyptian cultural values and its history is remarkable. But it becomes a very complicated, very, very complicated subject that is
And where are these conversations taking place? I mean, I imagine they're taking place in academic worlds, where people want to, still study a certain whatever. In budgets, in government worlds, how much are we going to spend on
yeah.
the Elgin marbles? But like, can you look in your crystal ball? Can you see in 100
Yeah,
years
so
what's
they are
going to
actually
happen?
happening in two worlds that don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
They are happening, of course, in universities, but when I mean universities, I mean normally conferences, forums, seminars, spaces that aren't even open to every single academic, and spaces that are
Oh,
not open to the public. I don't know if you guys know the average cost of attending a conference as a visitor in the United States. It's minimum $50 just to go to the conference, let alone
yeah.
staying in the conference, whatever you may want to do in the conference, etc., etc. If you're lucky and you join virtually, maybe they only charge you 10 or $20. But that's still money that not everybody necessarily has available to spare. And we are not talking of, the little conference that maybe your community college organizes. I'm talking of Kalamazoo, the largest international medieval conference in the whole world, one of the oldest. And even for somebody like me with academic credentials to present at Kalamazoo from my home in the UK, I would still have to pay $100 to $150 to talk for 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's
At
crazy.
the, at the largest at the largest medieval conclave for the discussion of things like this. So if that's happening in the world of academia, in the privileged world of academia, what is happening in the rest of the academic world is very disjointed, is very disconnected. So a lot of the places that are actually having these conversations tend to be private academic institutions that have funding, that have donors, that want to push these agendas and want to push them normally from the point of view of either the government or the public. So the problem is that normally academics are not often very involved with either the government or the public. So there is a massive wall in there that is stopping for a lot of the flow to happen. And then of course, yes, these conversations are indeed happening in in budgets, in parliaments, in social forums. But again, the ability that the vast majority of the ordinary public have to engage in this are normally through our political representatives. And of course,
Right.
once again, if you are a country like Switzerland, which is almost voting every other minute of the day to decide if the color of the recycling bin collections has to be pink or yellow, then maybe you get a choice. But if you are in a country like, well, the USA or the UK or Spain, where our parliamentary systems, although different, are more or less similar, you will have a much higher chance impacting your local government than your national government.
Oh, okay.
And there, the disparity of, involvement and impact is massive. And, in the vast majority of European countries, there is a huge difference between the amount of people that show up to a national election, let's say a general election, in comparison to, let's say, well, for example, in the UK, we have either national elections and local elections. And with local elections, I mean for the city and for our county. In Spain is similar. We have national elections, and then we have elections for our town hall and for our regional parliament. The amount of people that actually showed up to town hall and regional parliament elections to vote are much smaller. And yet, because that is what a lot of the community elements are discussed, they didn't pick up on the fact that that convent that is falling apart, but that is a true local gem of the 15th century, is up for discussion as to what we're going to do with it. The worst part of being a historian and tour guide all in the same place is that I get to see how this happens, on a day-to-day basis. There is
Right.
a beautiful, incredible site that you guys would love in Winchester. It's called Wolsey Palace. And it was one of the largest palaces that we had in the south of England during the Middle Ages. Ended up completely destroyed because of the war during the period of anarchy and then the English Civil War and now climate change, right? Um, but this local heritage site, which genuinely was of massive worth and is of massive worth to the community and the local area, and something that could potentially encourage people to move away from London and come visit, Winchester, is under the care of an institution called English Heritage. In England, we have two major um, heritage charities, the National Trust and English Heritage. All the sites that are owned by English Heritage are ruins, or the vast majority of them, 90% of them, are ruins, Stonehenge included. But because these heritage sites are not run by people in the heritage industry, but by businessmen who only care about, turning a quick buck, my local site, a place that is of historical, cultural, and heritage importance to not just any historian that knows the history of the area, but a local member of the community, is falling apart to the point that in 15 years of my lifetime, I've seen it deteriorate at a speed that is so fast, I don't think it will be here in 100 years' time if we don't do something about it, because it's left for dead. Meanwhile, I take cartloads of tourists to Stonehenge every year where the admittance ticket, by the way, is 30 pounds. Do not get close to the stones. You can see them in the exact same way on the other side of the fence, having paid 0, by the way. Just a hot tip. But, to what is not even the oldest or the most interesting stone circle in this country. So it's unfortunately a subject that it's very much, you know, of the essence. And the reason why I truly think, programs like this and public lecturing and tourism, but the kind of tourism that I do, not necessarily the kind of mass tourism that is promoted, is very important, because that's often one of the very few moments in time where ordinary people get a chance. They get a chance to interact and to have a say and to be able to do something about it. Without the knowledge and without the accessibility into those areas, no one cares. Or, well, me and maybe 4 more loons raving outside a place saying, hey, we need to take care of this thing.